Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. This is Mike Consul. Thank you for being here. In the spotlight is Vibhuti Jain, who goes by Vib for short. Vib is the author of Our Best Intentions, her first novel, one that she had multiple representation on, or offers of multiple representation from various agents, which is amazing. Let's say that. Any of us who have ever gone out there know how incredibly difficult it is to grab the attention of an agent, let alone multiple agents. Now, by way of background, Vib Jain lives with her husband and daughter in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she works in international development. She began her career as a corporate lawyer in New York. She holds degrees from Yale University and Harvard Law School, and she grew up in Guilford, Connecticut. Vib Jain, welcome to the program.
Hi, good morning. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. Excited to be here.
Thank you for taking the time. Listen, I'm going to start with an offbeat question. I've been familiar since my college days with the Jain religion, which, by the way, plays a prominent role in Philip Roth's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, American Pastoral. And your name happens to be Jain. Might you be a Jainist?
Yeah, so actually, my family is Jain. It is a religion. And yes, I've read American Pastoral. You're absolutely right. It's an Eastern religion that is very focused on nonviolence, very similar to Hinduism. Was sort of started as an offshoot of Hinduism, kind of a cross between Hinduism and Buddhism. So a lot of people with the last name Jain are, in fact, followers of the religion.
Well, I'm glad I didn't whiff on that one because I thought it was, Mike, you're making a false association here. It just happens to be a coincidence. There's only 6 million of you in the world. 6 million Jains in the world is my understanding. It's a very small religion based in India. And in some cases, the non-violence is taken to an extreme. I've heard of Jainists who actually will take a broom and sweep the ground in front of them as they walk so they won't crush even the smallest creature. Obviously, you don't live that way, I'm sure, but it can be taken to that kind of an extreme, if you would even call it an extreme. What else can you tell us about the Jainist religion? I will tell you that I read a book by one of the spiritual leaders of the Jains. I can't recall his name right now. I probably should have looked that up, but this was decades ago, and it was a book on meditation, and which I've read tons about meditation and Eastern philosophy and karma and so on. But his point, one of the key points he made is if you say you don't have time in your life for meditation, I would argue that your priorities are out of order. Are you a meditator?
I wish I was. I'd like to learn how to meditate. I think I do different things that are meditative for me. Like I actually think writing is often meditative for me.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that I meditate in the traditional sense, but I do agree. I mean, I think just having time to reflect, do something that opens your mind, that relaxes you is so important, whatever that
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Well, are you a practicing Jain, or is it a religion that you were born into? Like so many people, they get born into a religion and they identify with that, but they're not necessarily practicing.
Probably more of the latter. I mean, I do think it's a really interesting religion with a really interesting philosophy that it sounds like you might know more about than I do. No,
Well,
I mean, I think, look, uh, I'm always trying to learn. And if we can pick up good things from different influences in our life, I think that's a positive.
yeah, and the reason I ask, and a lot of my conversations with authors tend to be personality profiles because I think it's so important. Their background, what they value, what influenced them, it plays in their writing. Now, here you are with your debut novel called Our Best Intentions. And it's been received with some excitement, which is obviously very, very exciting for you. And yeah, you really are not a person who, I mean, you're a self-taught author, really, according to your, I forget if it's, I think it's Liz Stein, your editor, who was really impressed that you are basically self-taught. You obviously have an aptitude for writing and so on. Before we get into that part of it and how you found your agent, how you decided among the agents, since you had more than one offer, and the editing process you went through with Liz Stein, I'm interested in all of that stuff. But first, for our listeners, give us an overview of your new novel. Again, the title is Our Best Intentions.
Sure. So Our Best Intentions is what follows an Indian American single father, Bobby Singh, and his daughter, Angie Singh. It's set in the affluent suburbs of New York City, so fictional town in Westchester County. And a violent incident takes place in the public high school of that town. And the Indian American family is very much caught in the middle of the criminal investigation into what happened. And the book really unfolds in the aftermath of this crime, not just figuring out what happened, but navigating sometimes prickly issues of race, class, what it means to speak up for wrong and right when that's not entirely clear, and about moral responsibility. So that is the book. It touches on a lot of ideas that interest me, including family dynamics, social issues, class issues, and it was a lot of fun.
And mental health, mental illness plays in this
Mm-hmm.
story. I want to ask you about that in a minute, but first, the title, Our Best Intentions. Can you explain what's behind the name? What is it representative of?
Yeah, so a few things. When I was writing, I'm a lawyer by training. I went to law school, and I'm always so interested in looking at different stories and different perspectives and trying to figure out how it is that we come to such divergent conclusions from the same sort of basic set of facts or circumstances. And so when I was writing this book, I was really thinking about, so often we encounter people in our everyday lives and we think that person is so different than me because they've chosen to do X or they've chosen to do Y, and I would never do that. And therefore, we have nothing in common. And so I think a big inspiration in even writing this and writing it from multiple perspectives really was that when we distill different people as you know widely divergent as we may seem, we distill us down to our core desires, our core intentions. We all usually want the same things. We want to better our lives, want to better the lives of our loved ones. And the actions and decisions we take may be different, but there is this common desire among us all. And so Our Best Intentions is really about trying to look at what is universal among us, which is often our intent, rather than focus on what divides us. So it's meant to be unifying and also thought-provoking.
Now, talk about your protagonist, Babur Singh, who goes by Bobby Singh. Talk a little bit about Bobby Singh. What really drives him?
Absolutely. So Babur, aka Bobby Singh, is a first-generation American. He's of Indian origin, and he is a single dad. He is driven by a desire to essentially set himself and his family, himself and his daughter, up for financial stability and success in America. So he's motivated by this idea that if you work really hard, you'll advance in life. So really buying into, I know it sounds almost trite to say, but really buying into this concept of the American dream. He has a daughter, so obviously he is trying to create a better life for her. He's an eternal optimist. I mean, he really does believe that if you do the right thing, that if you follow the rules, the system works. And of course, the way I'm describing it, I'm kind of setting you up for the fact that in the book, I think he is forced to confront the stark reality that the world doesn't always work the way that we're told it does. It doesn't always work in straight lines. Things aren't always black and white. And there are inherent differences, some of which we sort of reinforce over time, that change how easy or difficult it is for someone to get a certain outcome, get their voice heard. So that's a little bit about Bobber. But he
Now is
is, I would say, oh, sorry, I was just going to say it was probably one of my favorite characters to write, because I just think characters who are eternally looking at the world and seeing the glass as half full are just characters that endear themselves to you.
Yes, you want to have a likable character in a book. I mean, that's not always the case, but oftentimes they say you got to have somebody that the reader's pulling for, or has a vested interest in the outcome. Again, though, that's not always the case, but obviously it is here. Now, is Bobby Singh patterned after anyone? Is there anybody you know, maybe not even personally, because there's so many highly successful Indian Americans, Silicon Valley alone. I mean, the people from India played a huge role in building Silicon Valley. Did you have somebody in mind to pattern him after anybody?
I think Bobby is sort of a composite of a lot of people from my parents' generation. That generation that first came over from India to the US and is really trying to navigate how to be American, what it means to fit in this country, and trying to figure out, when do we want to assimilate, when do we want to hold on to our identity, how do we raise our children in an environment that's so different than the one we grew up in. So I don't think he is modeled after any specific person, but a lot of interactions with that generation, and a lot of kind of thinking about their experiences and trying to imagine how they must have felt. And of course, Bobber's an Uber driver, so his reality is quite different than some of these Silicon Valley executives that I think we've become so familiar with in the news and in pop culture.
So, how I mentioned mental illness earlier. How does mental illness play in the story?
Great question. I'm glad you raised this. Yeah, I mean, I think I really so in the story, the character of Bobber is a single father, and he's a single father not because he's a widow, but because his wife effectively walked out on the family. She left Bobber and she left their daughter, and it seems she was suffering from postpartum depression and perhaps just other forms of depression, and didn't get the support she needed in her marriage and in her home environment, and ultimately had to make what I'm sure was a difficult decision for herself to leave her family. And I think in the story, the mother does not appear as a character, but the absence of the mother very much shapes Bobber and his daughter. It really influences how Bobber thinks about the world and how protective he is as a parent and the sense of responsibility he feels. And for Angie, I mean, I think every child is influenced by the presence or absence of their mother. And so the absence of her mother in many respects leaves her feeling like she's missing something, missing a portion of her identity. So mental illness is very much the catalyst for what causes this nuclear family to dissolve. And it's an idea that I think, it's a concept that I think is not really discussed openly in a lot of communities, including immigrant communities. And so it was important to me to write stigma so that there's less stigma attached to talking about these things.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a stigma here in this country. It's a stigma really around the world. So what about that? Is it any more of a, I should also add that right now it's just a crisis. The amount of depression and suicide among military veterans, among young people of all ages, really, it's become a really dire situation. But let's talk about the stigma of mental illness, because that's, I think, a big part of why so many people end up going untreated and end up dying from it by their own hand. Is the stigma of mental illness any more prominent, do you think, in Indian or Indian American culture than in other communities? Or do you see this as a universal problem and it's basically equivalent right across the board?
I think each community deals with mental illness in a different way. I don't think there's any community that's really got the right answer. I think we're a human race still trying to figure out, how do we talk about this? How can we be there for our loved ones when they're facing these types of issues? But I do think in immigrant communities, and not even specifically Indian communities, I do think the pressure to just make ends meet financially and to be physically okay often overshadows thinking about our emotional well-being. So if you're so concerned about, being part of the American middle class and affording your kids a shot at, the so-called American dream, you might overlook signs of mental illness. And so that's how I think it plays out in immigrant communities. It just feels like it's viewed as almost a luxury to address.
The pressure that is put on kids sometimes, especially immigrant children, their parents bring them to this country. There's a lot of pressure to succeed. I think it seems to be particularly acute among Asian communities, of which Indians are Asians, although they often are left out of that grouping. What about yourself? Did you feel a lot of pressure to succeed? Were you driven by your parents? I mean, you went to Yale, you went to Harvard Law School, you were a corporate lawyer, you decided to go into another field, probably still using your lawyering and international development. Did you feel that you had a lot of pressure on you to succeed in a way that is traditionally seen as a great success?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, my parents are both professionals. And I think when you have high functioning parents, there's always pressure to kind of live up to their expectations and live up to the standards they've set for themselves.
What do your parents do?
So my father's a physician and my mother's worked in pharmaceuticals.
Uh-huh.
And I think I wouldn't say there was pressure in the sense that we think of, kind of like in that tiger style of parenting where I was told, if you don't do this, you should be ashamed of yourself. It was never that explicit, but I do think there was a lot of focus on academic achievement in particular and on elevating certain career fields as more prestigious and more worthy of time and investment than others. So, and I think that's kind of true across the board for a lot of immigrant communities, and particularly Asian and South Asian communities. So, I do think there was some pressure, but maybe not as as bluntly applied as we sometimes think about.
When did you begin writing?
So I think most people who write, whether they study it or whether they kind of just do it in their own free time, I mean, I've write throughout their lives, and that's very true for me. I used to write a lot as a child. I think that's when our imagination is the least inhibited. And then for a long time, kind of following college, when I decided I was going to go to law school, I engaged in a very different style of writing. Communication served a very different purpose. And so I sort of gave up that creative writing. I continued writing as a lawyer and as a law student, but I stopped creative writing. And I really only rediscovered it as an adult when I made the career switch from being a lawyer to working in international development. And it's not to say that I couldn't have done this while I was a lawyer, but I think in my mind, I'd compartmentalized communication when I was a lawyer as being a very specific type of communication. And I needed to take a step back and kind of have a career change and some introspection to realize I was missing more creative styles of communication. So that's when I restarted writing. And it was, back to an earlier point in our conversation, for me, it was like meditating. It was just really freeing, really calming, and really fun.
So calming, there's a lot of people who wouldn't say it's calming to write. It's stressful to write because there's pressure to put good prose on the page, and you can never completely control that. It's a difficult act, but you do find it relaxing, and you find it a means of getting centered, it sounds like. just to pick up on some meditative type of language. I mean, that's oftentimes people meditate for the purpose of being centered.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it was. And I think maybe that's an experience you only have with your first book when you don't have any expectations and you're really writing, not even knowing what the end product is going to look like. Is it going to be a book? Is it going to be a short story? Are you just going to, is it going to be an unfinished novel? Um, I would say it's easier to get into my head as I work on my second novel because I now know the process and I have something to compare it to. Whereas when I was writing, drafts of chapters, it was just purely for me. It was fun. There was no deadline. There was no agent. There was no expectation of anything.
Now, your husband played a role in this, though, right? Even before you were married, when you two were dating, my understanding is that he played a role in resuscitation of your writing. What went on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I told him when I made a career switch to international development, and I suddenly wasn't working these corporate law hours, and I had more free time. I told him there's something missing in my life, and I want to do something else. I want to do something creative. I don't know what. Maybe I need to take an art class. I want to do something with my free time because I feel like I have this excess energy, and I need to channel it. Um, and he was very encouraging. We were visiting my parents right around the time, I think this is a little bit before we got engaged. And he and my mom were going through my old, short stories that I'd written as a child. And they were reading them, they were laughing about them. And it was that experience that really led him to say to me, I would love to see you write more. I think it would be so good for you. It'd be so fun. And I initially dismissed it, as we often do when our spouses have an idea for something we should do differently. And then little by little, the idea was kind of seed was planted in my head. The idea began to germinate, and I eventually came back to him and said, I would like to write. And of course, I presented it as if it was my idea, and it had nothing to do with it, which I'm sure he loved. But yeah, he's been one of my strongest supporters. He's been my number one beta reader, completely honest and unfiltered. Always gives me great ideas, and it's been really great.
Now, is he a fiction reader? Does he read fiction on his own, or is he only reading your fiction?
He's really only reading my fiction. He is an
Okay.
avid reader, reads a lot of nonfiction, much of which is, especially the narrative nonfiction is written in the style of a novel, but really an avid nonfiction reader. So it's kind of remarkable sometimes when he gives me edits or suggestions, and they're so good and pitch perfect. But I guess these are the things we do for the ones we love. So
Yes.
I'm very lucky.
So according to my notes here, you made a resolution in 2019 around the subject of writing. Is that correct? That resolution was to do what?
It was to start writing every day, or not even every day. It was just to start writing again. I started taking online writing classes, and that was my resolution. I said, you know what? I'm looking for a creative outlet. I'm going to take a class at Gotham. So I signed up for a class. One class led to another. And after my second class, I was like, you know what? I am going to write a book, and I'm going to form a writing circle in Johannesburg. I'm going to start reading a lot more so I know what kind of books are out there in the world, and what to expect when I say I'm going to write a book. Because for a long time, I'd even taken a hiatus from really reading voraciously, which is sad. And yeah, so that was the resolution that got it started.
So you took some online writing courses, as you say. What were the title of those courses? What was the subject matter?
So I took two classes at Gotham, and I don't remember the exact titles, but one was, I think, like Introduction to essay writing, maybe, or maybe Introduction um, to prose. I'm not quite sure, but one was a very intro level class that was really my way of testing the waters to see, can I even write again as an adult? I mean, I wrote as a 12-year-old, but clearly some time had passed and I needed to see if I could still do it, if I still liked my voice. As you said earlier, so often we have this vision for how polished we want our prose to sound, and then it gets on the page and you just cringe and you think this is horrible. Um, so I did that class, and then I did an introduction to fiction writing class, and that was the class that really got me thinking, if I want to write a book, I've got to just do it. I can't keep on taking these online classes where we write sort of short form pieces. I've got to just sit down and really dedicate myself to a project, because that was always the format that I think even when I was younger I gravitated towards.
Well, so May 2019 rolls around, and that's the flashpoint right there. That's when my understanding is you started to write this novel, and you had a draft by the end of the year. So really, in a matter of what is that, 7 months, you ended up writing a draft. How detailed was the draft? I mean, you spent 2020 reworking it, is my understanding. Then you sent out queries to
Mm-hmm.
agents. So how detailed was the draft, that 7 months that you spent putting it together? Was that just a very detailed outline, or was it really a completed novel that you knew that you needed to go back and start doing some rewriting on?
So it was my first draft of the actual novel. I'd written everything out. It was I mean, it was probably about 20% longer than the final book. It was, I guess writers call it their downdraft. Like, it was me just writing each chapter, not stopping to think, this isn't perfect, I need to change this. I'm just going to move on and write the next chapter. And sometimes I would stop and say, I really need to rework this, otherwise the story's not going to work. But not getting too bogged down in perfection, but saying, I just need to get the whole book out. I just need to get it down on paper. And then I need to take a good look at it and figure out what I need to fix. And of course, fixing is always the hardest part. So that was 2019, and I would be remiss if I didn't say Southampton Writers Conference played a really key role in my finishing the first draft of my novel. I went there in the summer of 2019, and for those not familiar with writers conferences, they're basically like summer camp for adults who want to write. And it was so inspiring to be surrounded by all of these people at different stages in their lives, some who had other careers, some who wanted to pursue this full time, and who all just were passionate about writing. Um, so it made me feel a lot less crazy and alone. And I think um, even though it was for just 2 weeks, it had this profound impact on my desire to just sit down and write this story.
So you're talking about Southampton, Long Island. Is that where it took place?
That's right. That's right. Southampton, Long Island.
And 2 weeks. So you were showing, you and the other participants were showing your writing and doing some writing there, reading to one another, I would imagine. And you had some expert or experts there who were helping with development. Does that kind of sum it up?
Absolutely. Yeah. We were basically workshopping early drafts of portions of our books. So some people had written their entire book by that point and were, sharing a chapter or two for feedback. I had written what later became kind of the early draft of one of the early chapters of my book. At that point in time, I thought it was the beginning of my book, but it ended up not being. And yeah, and I was getting feedback. I was sharing it with other people, and we were um, taught by Alexander Chi, celebrated novelist. And so it was a really great experience.
So you spent 2020 reworking Our Best Intentions, then you sent queries out to agents. And according to your agent, who is Alexa Stark at Writer's House, you received multiple offers of representation. And so how did you settle on Alexa Stark at Writer's House versus other agents that were interested? What was it about Alexa that you decided you're the one I want to represent me?
So it's a few things. First, I think I was looking for an agent who had the same vision for the novel. So if someone wanted to rewrite my book to, totally change the chronology or the perspective from which it's told, or a key plot point, I think that would have been more difficult for me to wrap my head around. So in general, Alexa and I saw eye to eye on the story that I was trying to write. And she made some really good suggestions as well, which also got me thinking that, she understood what I was trying to put out in the world. So that was one. Two, I felt like she had the industry knowledge to guide me through book publishing, which is a world I was completely unfamiliar with. She knew which publishers, imprints we pitch to, which editors at those imprints we pitch to, how to position the book for success. And so I felt like she had the business knowledge I needed for her to be my advocate and the artistic vision.
So how long, obviously it was a good marriage because you two have succeeded. How long did it take to find a publisher for Our Best Intentions?
So I think, so I made, when I started working with Alexa, we made some additional revisions. One thing I've learned is even when you think you've done the final revision, it's never quite over. Not until your book comes out. So I think it took I want to say it took about 5 months maybe for us before we sort of had decided we wanted to go with William Morrow. It might have actually been a little less time. That timeline is not as clear in my mind. I remember we had sort of the manuscript we wanted to send out to imprints in the summer of 2021. And so I think from there, it was probably it was under 6 months, I think, of going to different imprints and editors.
And the editor that you ended up with is Liz Stein of William Morrow. Talk about the editing process. Where did it start and how did it progress? Can you give us some kind of a sketch of that?
Yeah, working with Liz has been incredible. So I think from the very first conversations I had with her, it's clear that she was passionate about the book. She's really good at her job. And she's just such a great collaboration partner. So I think, the first thing we really did was we worked on finalizing the manuscript. And at this point, it was in pretty good shape, but I think there were some elements of the pacing and also some additional tweaks we made to the ending that really benefited from Liz's critical eye. So we did kind of another round of revisions of different portions of the book. It wasn't substantial, but they were definitely impactful enough that I think looking back on the draft that we'd sent to Liz versus what we have as the final book, you can see the improvement. And then of course there were several other rounds of sort of more technical revisions, going through with the copywriters and making sure there's no inconsistencies and timelines or references. And then I know a lot of fun stuff like conferring on our ideas for the cover design or talking about, who do we want to read the audiobook and really getting ready for publication, thinking about our pub date and coming up with a marketing and publicity plan. So the process with Liz was, I would say, very collaborative. For me, it was, as a first-time author, it was a lot of learning all the different steps that go into putting a book out into the world that I think as a reader I never appreciated. So it was a really great experience, much more detailed and many more steps than I would have ever imagined, but really a great process and one that really pushed me to work on improving something I'd written, back in 2019.
Did you ever consider being the reader for the audio edition? Is that something you thought about? Did you discuss it with Liz? Did she maybe say you're best off with a professional reader? Obviously, the author knows every emphasis, every inflection that they wrote into that. So it's not unusual for an author to read their own work and for the audio edition. Did you ever consider that?
Great question. So initially I was intrigued by the idea of doing it, and then I actually started listening to a number of audiobooks. And I noticed that most of them had professional readers. And I don't think, in kind of introspecting, I don't think I would have been as dynamic as the reader whom we ended up selecting. So we went with a professional actor who has read a number of books. It's also a lot to read, and I'm sure it's incredibly exhausting. And I told Liz that I just wanted the best product out there. So if it was going to sound more amateurish because I insisted on reading it, I didn't want that to be the case. And I was happy to go with a professional. So that's what we did.
And you've been pleased with the outcome, with the voice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've listened to the audiobook in the car actually, and I love it. I'm very happy with the outcome.
How many weeks or months did it take to complete the editing process with Liz? Roughly.
So that's a good question. I mean, it's a slightly unusual question or idiosyncratic question for me because I just delivered my daughter at the time I got her first set of edits, and I essentially needed extra time because I had a newborn and was a first time new mom. So I think I took longer than I probably would have normally needed. I probably took from about March until end of June. Whereas if I'd, not had the life change going on in the background, I probably could have completed it in about a month.
So what did you learn during the editing process that you're currently applying to your new book that you're working on?
I'm trying to recapture the uninhibited nature of my writing when I was writing the first draft. Because I think I've been actually having to stop myself from over editing as I'm writing because the first draft is never that good. It's always got to be improved. It's never the final, it's just the draft. And I think I've been trying to remind myself that this is what happened with the first book, and it's okay if the first draft of the second book is just not the final product. And that's been the hardest thing. I've also been trying to recreate, although it's a little harder this time, this sense of not feeling pressure. So I think that was really important for me when I was writing. It's a lot harder now, obviously. I mean, I do have a book out in the world. And so I have something to compare this second book to. And then I think the other sort of lesson learned is writing a book is all about patience and being willing to revise. I mean, I think I revised my first book more times than I thought was humanly possible. And so I think I'm just trying to go into this one, reminding myself it's a marathon, not a sprint. And, I've just got to buckle in for a long ride.
Now, your first novel, as I say, it was very well received. There's got to be some pressure on the second one. You don't want the sophomore jinx to apply in this case. I will say that Liz Stein is quoted as saying this about your novel, and I'm quoting from her: "The book hit the sweet spot for me between literary and commercial, a home run for book clubs." Now, I'm not sure about book clubs and why that makes it a home run, but that's always such a challenge. There tends to be either books written for popular approval, tends to be heavily plot driven, and oftentimes is not very literary. You are a literary writer, and I think that probably was what grabbed the attention of agents, was that you not only were telling a compelling story, but the writing itself was at a higher level than commercial fiction, that you have a literary voice. What about that? Did you spend any time thinking in terms of balancing the two, or was this just a natural byproduct of who you are in the storytelling that you were doing?
So I didn't consciously think about it when I was writing my first book because I didn't I didn't even know I was going to end up publishing a book. I always hoped that I would one day, but it was such a distant dream that I don't think I was even thinking about, is this going to be commercial or literary? I think I have always wanted to, if I were to, I'd always told myself, if I were to write a book, I'm okay with people not finding it appealing to the masses, as long as whoever does read it says, this is good writing. Because I was like, you know what, at least I would feel proud of the work product. It might not appeal to everyone, but the quality was good. So that concept had always been important to me. I think as I'm writing my second book, I do think I'm trying to erase the voices that are telling me what makes something commercial and what makes something literary, and just try to be myself. But it is really hard. And I think one of the compromises I made with my first book, which I actually think makes for it being a better read, was having a more complete ending, an ending with more resolution. When I initially wrote the book, I really had wanted to end it as true to life as possible. And I think I moved in a direction that was closer to tying up some of the issues and the problems, maybe not entirely neatly, but more so than what I'd initially written. And I think overall I'm happy with that change, but it was definitely not what I'd gravitated towards when writing. But sometimes what we gravitate towards is not what we want to, what we ourselves want to read. So it is always a balancing act between your artistic vision and what makes for a good story.
Hmm. Yeah. He said, Liz Stein also said that she liked the multiple themes. You had a parent-child relationship. There are parent-child relationships, belonging, homelessness. So these, of course, were compelling themes to her. In art to people, parent-child relationships are everywhere. Homelessness seems to be everywhere, unfortunately. There's
Yeah.
always that desire for a sense of belonging in some way. We all feel alien in some way. It seems that we're all looking for our place in the world, even if on the surface it looks as though we're very much part of that mosaic. I think every strand or every thread of the mosaic tends to feel a little bit like, do I really fit in here? Is this really me? There's always some degree of alienation that's part of the human condition, it seems. So, Liz also said, Liz Stein, your editor, also talked about Our Best Intentions featuring, and I bring this up because you mentioned pacing earlier, which I think so many authors do not think in terms of pacing, and it's so important to making a book really a good read. She talked about how Our Best Intentions features the pacing of a suspense novel with high level writing, which is interesting because I think readers tend to really gravitate towards something that's got some real momentum at that kind of pacing, where there's the level of or the pacing of a suspense novel, as Liz Stein put it. And but then there's also this other factor, and this is what I want you to address, that pacing. And the other factor is modulation, because you can't just run at the same speed all the time or it becomes uninteresting. There's times when you need to slow it down and broaden out a little bit, perhaps, especially at points that are really important to the story. What about that? How conscious were you of the pacing, or times when you needed to modulate that pacing? Again, you are kind of it sounds to me like you're a natural writer, so maybe this stuff came naturally to you, but I'm curious how much of it was strategic in your own head.
That's a really interesting question. So I think my natural inclination, especially when I was writing like the early drafts, was to over include. So I think because I put in so much detail and so much introspection, the earlier drafts I think felt clunkier, like they needed to pick up pacing sometimes and modulate, as you say. So you have some sections that are, go a little deeper, that move a little slower, and others that really keep the story moving. And I think when I was writing the first draft, because I put so much in and I wasn't really overly editing, the story read in a way that it would get stuck. It felt slow. And so I think Liz's edits really helped accelerate when we needed to. And I think there was already enough deceleration already built in. And I think seeing how she edited helped me pick that out. Because sometimes when you write, you can't actually see these weaknesses in your own writing, because you kind of get almost wedded to the like this depth of storytelling, because it's the backstory you create in your head to make the characters and the setting believable. And so you lose sight of the fact that sometimes we don't need all that detail to get the point across to the reader. So I think, Liz was really, really helpful with that, as was Alexa.
So you're working on your next novel. What can you tell us about that?
So it's definitely a departure from this one. I mean, this one was really, I wouldn't say it's a novel centered around a crime. I don't know if thriller is the best word, but it's definitely a novel about a criminal investigation. The second book is about envy and voyeurism and pursuit of happiness. It's about a woman who is very stuck in her life and reconnects with a childhood friend whom she's also envied growing up, and becomes unhealthily involved in her life and crosses a lot of sort of moral and ethical boundaries. And in doing so, keeps telling herself that if my life were only like this other person's, it would be so much better, but sort of loses sight of herself and of her own conscience. So it touches on a lot of different themes, how easy it is to commit a small transgression, and then from there another transgression and another transgression, and how these things keep on compounding or snowballing. And just this era we live in of just constantly feeling dissatisfied with our lives because we think someone else has it better. So
right. There's always a party we're missing, a party we haven't been invited to. We're always missing out on something, it seems. Media has a lot to do with that, don't you think? I mean, social media and all, they put glamorous living in front of everybody's face. Not that these people's lives are really all that glamorous, but they portray themselves that way. And then a lot of people feel that, why am I not included? Why am I missing out? So there's some degree of that in that book. Okay. Now, are these characters going to be Indian Americans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I mean, I think, look, I'm an Indian American. That is my experience. I think many of the characters in this book will be Indian American, but it's not because it's a book about race, but it's because it's a book about Indian Americans who are just Americans. It's about mainstreaming people's stories, because if we don't tell our stories, then we're not part of the conversation and we're not part of America, or what people think America is. So it's important to me to write characters whose stories and voices I feel like I can tell. But that doesn't mean my writing is going to be limited to writing about race, because I think that's only just a fraction of someone's identity.
Okay, so not necessarily about race, but will you be an Indian American writer? In other words, will that be your lane? Do you, I mean, just as Anne Rice decided that vampires, that was her channel. That's what really worked for her. That's what she was passionate about and was able to really convey a lot of passion through that, or eroticism. What, will you be an Indian American writer? Will your books be Indian American in nature?
I think yes and no. I mean, I think I'll tell stories with Indian American characters, but they won't necessarily be about identity and race beyond, how any other writer's stories touch on identity and self-knowledge. And I think I don't know that I don't know that I've thought that far in advance, but I certainly don't want to be pigeonholing myself at this point in my career, because I hope to write a lot. And so
it's early.
yeah,
It's early. But the reason I ask that question is because there's been these a lot of people don't realize how big an audience there is there. I mean, when you stop and think about a movie like Slumdog Millionaire that came out, and it was huge. In fact, I think it won Best Picture. And then Crazy Rich Asians comes out, huge. Yeah, not really a great movie, but it was very popular. And I saw both of them. I'm a white American. I was interested. So there's not only a large Asian audience right here in America, but there's people, white people and people of other colors are interested in that. So to be able to kind of capture that audience or that lane can be, I mean, there's no end to the subject matter, just like with any other culture. But in addition to that, there is kind of this built-in audience there. Now you have to deliver for them, but I think any publishing house would look at that and say there's opportunity here for big sales, and not that that's the only thing that you're concerned about. You obviously want your books to be meaningful and to be literary and so on. Is there any chatter right now, or is Alexa, your agent, working furiously on seeing if maybe Our Best Intentions is ripe for the silver screen?
We are definitely hopeful. There's a writer's strike right now in Hollywood, which I'm hoping gets resolved in a way that people are happy with. I think that's got some implications, but yeah, we're having some interesting conversations. And I mean, I think the movies you pointed out are all great examples of how everyone wants to see themselves represented in media. So there's that element to it, but there's also, if you tell an entertaining story, it doesn't matter what your background is. I mean, I love reading and watching things about people from totally different backgrounds than me, because it's my way to learn about someone else's world, or to experience someone else's world. Like right now, I'm watching a Netflix series on a sumo wrestler. I have no interest in being a sumo wrestler. I've never been to Japan, and yet it's so interesting to watch this show, and a lot of the emotions are universal.
Yes, yes. Now you work in international development. What exactly do you do?
So I run the Africa office for the U.S. government's development finance institution. So basically, our overseas investment bank. So I support development in African countries by investing in the private sector there.
Does that
And
include micro loans and all that? Micro loans to?
micro,
Uh-huh.
micro and macro. So large scale infrastructure plus investing in small businesses and everything in the middle.
Interesting. Okay, so that's got to be a busy job. And you have a child and you have a husband, and you write. You made this resolution. You're dedicated to your writing now. You're off to a great start. So how do you fit the writing in? What's your commitment each day to writing when you're in the throes of writing a book like you are now? What's your regimen?
So I actually probably need to develop a schedule. I hesitated to do so when I wrote my first book, but my life has changed quite a bit since then, as you've noted. Um, so right now I write when I have free time and when I am just in the mood to write. I think that worked for my first book, but I think for my second book, I'm trying to be more deliberate and thinking through having a writing schedule. I'm not sure that it will be writing every day, because I'm someone who needs long stretches of time to actually get to the point where I'm happy with what I'm putting down on the page. But I do think it will be finding those consolidated segments of time and just dedicating them to writing and being a little bit more disciplined about schedule. Things you think about as a parent when you've got other things you could be doing.
What is your state of mind while you're writing? How would you characterize that? What's kind of that state of mind while you're at the keyboard or writing on the writing pad?
Curious, lost in thought, um, inspired, and then sometimes just defeated. And that's when I go for long walks and think about, why can't I figure this out? What would this character do? How can I change this? This is not working. What do I write next? So I think it's a whole gamut of emotions.
The walks are helpful, aren't they? They
Yeah.
stimulate, their
Yeah.
brain stimulation comes with walking. And I mean, that's been my experience. In fact, I bought a recorder many years ago when I noticed, wow, all these ideas are coming while I'm walking and I don't have a way to put them down. Went out, got myself a recorder and did that. So I don't think that's unusual among writers, but just the actual movement, actually getting up and taking a walk is powerful. And that's been your experience, it sounds like.
Absolutely. It clears your head. It's good to get fresh air, gives you perspective. It allows you to, yeah, it just allows you to think.
So if you could go back in time, what would you tell a 20-year-old Vib Jain? I mean, you're so young as it is. So normally I say a 25-year-old, but I'm going back to 20 because you're so young. What would you tell Vib Jain, age 20, just in terms of what would you want to communicate to her to kind of allay maybe some insecurities or to set a path for her? What would you tell her?
One, I would tell her to continue writing and reading, something that I'd kind of taken a break from doing for fun in law school, and to not feel like you need to put boxes and compartments around your life for so long. I felt like if I'm committed to my career, I don't have the mental space to do anything else. And at the time, my career was being a corporate lawyer, and I just, yeah, I would tell her that. I would tell her, much like the themes in my second book, to think about all the things that are good in my life and to be satisfied with them. Um, I mean, I think a big part about being comfortable writing for me, because it's therapeutic in many ways, has also come with being comfortable in my own skin. And I think so often when we're 20 years old, we just don't know who we are. We don't know what voice we want to have in the world, and we don't know, how we want others to perceive us, or how we even perceive ourselves. And I think so much of that noise can be erased if we just focus inwards. So maybe
Mhm.
bringing this conversation back full circle, we started talking about Jainism.
Exactly. Exactly. What's the best piece of writing advice you ever received that you can pass along to others?
Write with specificity. I mean, you asked me earlier, do I think of myself as an Indian American writer? I think if you write really specific characters and settings, if you write, a really specific character who's an Uber driver, but you write that person so true to life, it doesn't matter if your reader is an Uber driver. They will identify with that person because they will see their humanity and feel their emotions. So even if they are of a different race, of a different generation, of a different socioeconomic status, you make that character universal by being specific.
What aspect of your writing do you consider to be your greatest strength? Is it dialogue? Is it character development? Is it relationships? Is it pacing? Um,
So I'd like
is
to
it
get better
mood
at
setting?
pacing.
Oh,
I'd
is
like
that
to get
right?
better
Yeah.
at pacing. So I'm not sure it's pacing. Um, I think it's description. I think it is. I think it's my description. I think I try to add an element of beauty and poetry to description without it being so esoteric that you kind of lose the narrative thread.
Hmm. Hmm. Would you listen to music when you write, or any other sounds while you're writing?
No, I don't.
You
I
like
love music.
silence?
I do. I do. I need silence. When I start listening to music, I can't then focus on my writing because I become so engrossed in the music.
Do you play an instrument yourself, or are you just a music lover as a listener?
Just just a listener, just a fan. I took some years of piano lessons and played very badly, but no, I cannot. I don't even know if I remember how to read music. So
So how do you expect your writing to change as you age? Do you have any sense of that as, in another 10, 20, 30 years, you got a long career ahead of you. Do you have any sense of how it will change over time,
I mean, I think as
or
we
how
have
you
more
want
life,
it to change maybe?
Yeah, I think as we have more life experiences, we see the world in different ways. We view relationships and people in different ways. Because a lot of writing is making observations about, you know, people and situations, and it's your perception of those things. So I think as we have more life experiences, you just keep on shifting your perspective and perception of how we view the world. And I hope my writing reflects that. Um, I also think the themes we write about probably also mature as we age. I don't know that as a 20-year-old I'd even think about writing a book about um, pursuing happiness and have a view on it.
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, Vib Jain, you are off to a terrific start. You've got Alexa Stark, your agent, at your side. You've got Liz Stein, your editor, at your side. You've got great representation there, great assist. And I wish you the best of luck with this novel and in your forthcoming novel. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation, Mike.